this whole discussion on truth is somewhat facilitated. We started by talking about doubt and things that hinder us from making a strong claim to the idea that we can know God exists or that we can know God personally. So I'm going to the other side of the coin, and I want to talk about, truth and what's the nature of truth. And really tonight I want to focus on some things that are slogans that would give you reasons for being skeptical, at least with related to truth claims. Here's why I'm doing that. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was sitting in Starbucks, or as I like to call it, $4. And if you're there, you know exactly why I call it that. So I'm sitting in $4, and I end up having a conversation with a guy. And it was a really interesting conversation because at the end of it, we find out that he's very skeptical as to whether or not God exists. But when he finds out that I'm a pastor, it brings on this conversation. Why do I think that God exists? Well, is there any evidence for your beliefs? I'm totally open to those kinds of conversations. But at the end of the conversation, he said something that was very interesting, and it also is pretty common to hear. What he basically did was he more or less celebrated the fact that I was a Christian, but then he followed it up with this. He said, and I love that, and that's true for you. That's true for you. It's just not true for me. Now, I don't know how many of you have heard something like that, but it's a pretty common thing to hear. So it didn't surprise me to hear it. And what happened was it facilitated a little bit more of a conversation because we thought our conversation was coming to a close. And so I was like, it's interesting that you say that because I want to think about that with you for just a little bit. And then kind of off we went. So really what I was there for at $4 didn't even happen. And I had that opportunity and that conversation with that young gentleman. How many of you watch Star Wars? Star Wars fans? Yeah, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Now you got to pay attention. I enjoy Star Wars. I just don't take my life cues from Star Wars, if you know what I mean. Obi-Wan Kenobi, talking to Luke, said, very famously, by the way, he says, Luke, you're going to find that many of the truths we cling to depend greatly on our own point of view. Now, for those of you that have watched Star Wars, you can probably even go to that scene in your mind when Obi-Wan is saying that to Luke. And I'm sitting there going, I remember watching it and going, no, Obi-Wan, that's false. That's false. Truth is not determined by a point of view. It's that we have a point of view that we hope is true. As a matter of fact, one of the catchphrases for Star Wars is only a Sith deals in absolutes. You know what I'm talking about? And of course, when this line comes out, I'm like, well, is that absolutely true? If so, then you're a Sith. All the Jedi are now gone, right? See, the movie's over with. These slogans can really kind of catch us off guard. And to the point that we feel like we really don't know what to say in response to them. So I just want to give a few responses to that catchphrase. When somebody says, hey, now that's true for you, and that's even good. I celebrate the fact that you're a Christian. It's just not true for me. How do we think about that? Well, I want to point out a few things that I think will help. And the first is this, the truth can be elusive. The truth can be elusive. We have to be fair here. There are a number of things that even after a lot of investigation, some of us are sitting there going, I'm not sure. I'm just not sure. And there are significant disagreements even. And I don't mean just in religious beliefs. There are significant disagreements in political beliefs. There are significant disagreements in moral beliefs. In fact, next Sunday, I'm going to be dealing with the topic of abortion, largely because of the discussion that's happening in New York and in Virginia. So we're just going to shift gears and go that way. But moral beliefs, we disagree. And so as a result of kind of a widespread disagreement, some have come to the conclusion to say, well, since there is so much disagreement, then relativism must be true. And that's what I want to think about. Think of some of the differences that we see. There are some people that hold to what are called New Age beliefs. This is sometimes encapsulated in the phrase, all is one. Have you heard that before? Well, that's one belief. How about this one? Historic Hinduism believed that there were many gods, and in some of its current iterations, as many as 330 million gods. Okay, that's a different belief. How about atheism? Atheism is the belief that there is no God. How about Christianity? Christianity is the belief that there is one God in three persons. Now, here's the thing, and probably all of you are catching on to this right off the bat. They can't all be right. Or another way of saying it, they can't all be true. We're saying some things that are mutually exclusive. If one is true, then another is ruled out. And moreover, it's been observed that a number of beliefs, in our case tonight, we're just worried about religious beliefs. Some would even say, your belief is largely dependent on where you came from. And there's a little catchphrase that you might even see connected to it. Like if you'd been born in Iraq, you would be a Muslim. If you'd been born in India, you would have been a Hindu. All of these figures of speech really represent what it is that we're talking about tonight. So how should we think about these things? I want to make just a few suggestions tonight. Hopefully they help you out. And here's the first. It's wise to admit that discerning the truth is difficult. It's wise. But that doesn't mean that the truth is created by a culture or an individual. It also doesn't mean that the truth can't be discovered. The only thing that it means is that the truth is elusive and it's difficult. That's all that it means. Here's what when it comes down to a definition of truth, I hold to what's often called the correspondence theory of truth. And here's the basic idea, is that you have the world and then you have your beliefs. And in order to say that your belief is true, it corresponds or it matches to the way that the world is. There's a relationship there. So when you have the world and it just is existing the way that it is, and you have a belief and those things match, we have a word for that. And the word is true, right? That's the correspondence theory of truth. A relativistic theory of truth doesn't hold to that. Instead, a relativistic theory of truth is going to hold to a couple of different things. One, it's true for you, that is, as an individual, or it's going to get past the individual and say, no, truth is held by a group of people, maybe a society or a culture. You see the difference there? So Paul Copan, and I love this, he says, hey, look, acknowledging the roots or a context of a belief says nothing about whether or not that belief is correct or true. In fact, it might identify how beliefs actually trend in cultures, but it says nothing of the truth of the beliefs in those cultures. So even if you were to look over in India and say 80-something% or 90% of the people in India are Hindu, that shows you something about the trends of beliefs there, but it doesn't say anything as to whether or not those beliefs are true. Moreover, we wouldn't want to say that truth is geographical. That's just a strange thing to say. And by the way, I want to point this out. Certainly nobody is saying that scientific or mathematical truths are geographically located. So when it comes to math and science, it seems to be a little bit different. Really, the conversation here, when people become somewhat relativistic about their beliefs, is usually in two domains, morality and God. And everything else, it's like, nope, the truth is objective. Math is what it is. Science is what it is. But on the face of it, here's the thing. We know that can't be right. We know that that can't be right. We can't say that in some ways, in some areas, or in some areas of inquiry, truth is purely subjective or relative, and in other areas, the truth is purely objective. The truth doesn't work like that. So, as Paul Copan goes on to say, if what you want to do, if you want to be a relativist about the truth, and you want to say that your beliefs are shaped by culture, here's the thing. That would even mean that your relativistic view is shaped by a culture. That's where it's come from. And that's what gets us to the slogan, kind of important, where my friend was talking to me at $4 the other day, or a couple weeks ago. I celebrate the fact that you're a Christian, and that's true for you. It's just not true for me. How do we think about that? Here's a few things worth thinking about. If my belief is only true for me, then why isn't his belief only true for him? You see it? If my belief is only true for me, then why isn't his belief only true for him? I mean, the problem with this is pretty obvious. You can't say on the one hand that no belief is true for everyone, and then make the claim that the one claim that is true for everyone is that there are no universal or objective truths, which is exactly what was said to me in $4 not long ago. What is the one thing that is absolutely true? And the answer would be, is that the truth is relative. But you can't say that, not even by its own definition of truth. The other thing is, like I said, you can't just cherry pick where it comes from. The moral implications of that statement are enormous. They're huge. I mean, he and I were talking about belief in God, right? That's true for you. But if we start looking at how that applies to other areas, the implications are huge. I mean, absurd consequences really do follow from relativism. Let me just talk about moral relativism for just a second. If it's true that no objective moral norms apply to all persons at all times in all places, let me give you one example. It's wrong to torture babies for fun. There's an example. If that's not true across all times, all cultures, and all places, then the following moral judgments also have to be denied. Pay attention. Mother Teresa was morally better than Adolf Hitler. You actually can't say that. Rape is always wrong. You actually couldn't say that. It's wrong to torture babies for fun. You actually could not say that. But here's the thing. If you deny those judgments are universally true, it certainly seems absurd. Like on the face of it, it just seems absurd. Every instinct within us tells us at least some moral judgments are absolutely correct, and regardless of what other cultures or what other individuals even think. Here's a second thing to think about. If the relativist is going to claim that morality is relative to an individual, I'm the one that determines what is right and wrong, what happens when individual moralities conflict? Here's an example by Francis Beckwith. Here's what he said. For example, Jeffrey Dahmer. You remember Jeffrey Dahmer? He was the mass murderer. He was known for cannibalizing, eating his victims. Jeffrey Dahmer's morality apparently permitted him to cannibalize his neighbor. His unfortunate neighbor likely did not share Dahmer's particular tastes. And that wasn't exactly my wording, that was his. I just thought it was hilarious, right? He didn't share his taste. So here's what Francis Beckwith went on to say. What would the relativist suggest be done to resolve the moral conflict between the cannibal and his reluctant dinner? What would he do? Since nobody's morality is in principle superior, should we then flip a coin and just say that it's determined because, hey, might makes right? Whoever is in a position of power then gets to say what is right. And in addition, if the moral life is no more than a reflection of a person's individual taste, preference, orientation, then we have no legitimate basis for telling young people that it's morally wrong to lie, it's morally wrong to cheat, it's morally wrong to steal, or it's even morally wrong to kill newborns. We would have absolutely no moral foundation to make those claims. And moreover, and this is the second point, since each of us belongs to a number of different societies or cultures, this conversation could get even more tricky. Let me give you an example. Suppose that I am a lawyer, right? And let's say that I am a lawyer and I have a pretty strict Catholic background. And in my Catholic background, what that means is that I'm going to advocate for the life of a child in the womb, as the Catholic Church staunchly does. But then let's suppose that I go to work. And as I go to work and I work for a law firm, they don't necessarily hold those beliefs. In fact, as I go into the law firm and I'm working at the behest of the firm, maybe asked to represent a family in a case that goes against those beliefs. Now, the reason I'm even bringing that example up is to make a very simple point. I'm one person, but what's my culture? Is my culture my Catholic background? Is my culture the law firm that I'm in? If you're a relativist, here's the thing. Here's what this means. Even if I were to, say, practice my Catholic faith and advocate for life in the womb, on the one hand, and then go to work and advocate for something like a pro-choice view there, the only thing that could really be said is that I have a different approach. One's not morally better than the other. You actually couldn't say that. But you can also see the deeper point. It's really hard to figure out what in the world we even mean by a culture. Think in the United States. How many beliefs about God are there? Tons. How many different moral beliefs are there? Quite a few. You get the idea? Some maybe go to this church, but then you go out and you work in a different place. What's your culture? It can become very difficult to even define. And moreover, here's the thing. Even if morality was reducible down to culture, there couldn't really even be moral progress. It would make no sense. The only way that we can meaningfully say that a culture is getting better or progressing is if there are norms that are stable, or we would say objective, we're not making this stuff up, that exist independently of that culture. So here's the standard, and then we're judging the actions of that culture based on it. It's the only way that we can know that as a society, we're actually progressing or digressing, as the case may be. There has to be some superior moral principles to which the progressing society has to draw closer. However, if what is morally good is merely what your culture says is morally good, then again, the only thing that we can say is that we're changing. Not that society is progressing, not that society is getting better. But think about this. Would anybody suggest that the abolition of slavery in the United States was an instance of genuine moral progress? I don't see anybody even debating that now. That as a society, once we took a stand against what was a moral atrocity, we as a group advanced morally. We were better for having done it. So the question became, did America change for the better, or did it simply change? If you're really a relativist, you would have nothing to gauge it by. J.P. Moreland, he has a book called Scaling the Secular City. And in it, he makes this point. He says, I want to add, in addition to all of this discussion, if cultural relativism is true, there can be no true or admirable reformers of a culture. There could be no true or admirable reformers of a culture. In fact, if relativism is true, and you were to say, hey, we are what determines something is right or wrong, then some of the best reformers that you have in the history of the world were in fact doing something morally wrong. Because if the culture is what determines something is right, and you have somebody like a Gandhi that's stepping up against the abuses in the caste system in India, or you have something like a Martin Luther King Jr. that's willing to take the reins and bring a lead in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, or somebody that's pretty close and near and dear to my heart. How about the moral reform that Jesus was trying to bring to his people? What you would have to say to be consistent is all of them did something that was immoral, if this view is correct. Here's what Moreland went on to say. Remember, you can't have any admirable reformers of a culture, right? Here's what he went on to say. If cultural relativism is true, then it's impossible in principle to have a true moral reformer who changes a society's code and does not merely bring out what was already implicit in the code. For moral reformers, by definition, change a society's code by arguing that it is somehow morally inadequate. We're missing the mark, in other words. But if cultural relativism is true, an act is right if and only if it is in society's code. And that's why the reformer would be, immoral. But here's the thing. He goes on to say, but it would be odd, to say the least, for someone to hold that every moral reformer who ever lived, Moses, Jesus, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, was immoral by definition. Any moral view which implies that is surely false. And so in order to be consistent, the cultural relativist has to deny that real moral progress or real moral reformers even exist. Have to deny it. And I just want to make one last point, at least for tonight. Practically speaking, this is totally unlivable. It's just completely unlivable. So if a person were to say, okay, so Jeremy, Christianity is true for you. Well, really the question is Christianity true? Right? That's the real question. But practically speaking, this idea of a relativistic view of truth, it is unlivable. William Lane Craig makes a great point, and I think it'll make it hit home. Here's what he said. Nobody is a relativist when it comes to medicine. Nobody. Nobody is. He's in the example that would prove the point is nobody is willing to take rat poison when really what they're looking for is an antibiotic. Right? I mean, by the way, both of those might help with some of the symptoms of your sickness, but one of those is going to help in a way that you don't really want, right? Because you're not going to be feeling anything because you're dead. Nobody's a relativist when it comes to medicine. And so those are some things to think about, at least with regard to this slogan, right? So you might hear it. I've heard it definitely enough, but it's what should facilitate a deeper conversation. Hold on. I mean, could we even live this way? Well, that's true for you. No. Remember, the best way of understanding what the truth is that you have a belief. Everybody has them. But what we want to know is whether or not our beliefs actually correspond or match the way that reality is. And some beliefs, by definition, rule out the truth of other beliefs. Now that's a good place to stop, and I'm going to tip you off on something. Apparently our code is changing or changed. So here's what I'm going to do. Put this number in, 68743. Y'all got it up there? 68743. And we've got some chairs up here. Thank you so much. Let me move this really fast. And I'm just going to sit down. And Melody's going to help us out.
We're just going to have an awkward silence while you all submit some questions. Just kidding. All right, so Menti.com, our new code 68743. So as you guys kind of get on there and put in your questions, I thought it might be kind of fun. Like all of us have had those conversations like you had with the guy at Starbucks of, okay, well, you spend all that time explaining God or Christianity or whatever it is you're debating, and then they pull out well, that might be true for you, but that's not true for me. Can you just walk us through like a 2-minute concise version of what you just went through? Like, where do you even start with trying to explain the flaws of relativism in a few-minute conversation in Starbucks?
Right. Well, honestly, some of the stuff that I point out tonight is a place that I like to go. One, because when you're saying something about relativism, you're saying something about the nature of truth itself, right? Which is why I said you can't cherry pick where you're a relativist. The truth is either relative or it isn't. So that's the first thing that I would try to point out, and then get over into areas that we know are going to impact life, right? Because that's typically what kind of makes it hit home, which is why I gave some of the examples that I did before. Nobody wants to say that Mother Teresa isn't, morally superior to Hitler. Everybody wants to say that she is what I'm trying to say, morally superior to Hitler. However, if we were to say that, morality is relative, we would have a hard time making that kind of claim. So I try to get it to where it's going to hit the thick of their experience, because of course we want to look at like a Hitler and say that what he was doing was more than in bad taste. And the other thing that we want to be able to say is to look at even a culture. Like in that case, anybody that was willing to go and support and even willing to fight and die for what he was up to say they were on the wrong moral road. Or to even look at the United States and say, in a case like what was going on in Nazi Germany, we had the moral ground to intervene on behalf of people to do the right thing. However, if you were to take that cultural kind of relativism, we wouldn't be able to make that claim. And so I try to go to those examples. Anytime you can go into Hitler, that just tends to make it a little bit juicier. But it helps to make the point, because it hits your experience. And we could look at some other examples that are going on in our world right now. You really don't always have to go back to World War II. I just like World War II history, so that's why I go there. How about this? How many of you remember genocide in Rwanda? Or how many of you remember genocide in Darfur? You could go to examples that are a little bit nearer, at least in history. And people were even asking, hey, where's the United States in this? Now, the thing is when they're asking, where's the United States in this, the basic idea behind it is that we have some moral obligation to step up and to advocate for these people that are being slaughtered by an immoral government. I'm like, okay, but here's what that means. That means that this idea of truth has got to go. And we got to get onto the same page as to what the nature of the truth actually is. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, that's very helpful.
Yeah.
All right, we got some questions rolling in here. Okay, so Christianity has a lot of competition for being the most dependable belief structure. So where do we start? How do we wade through all of the information that's being thrown at us?
Right. So how do you wade through all the information? A couple of weeks ago, I made some suggestions. Well, who do I read? Where do I go? Where do I study? And I said, look, the best thing that you can do is to identify the people that are the most respected in an area and study them. But here's the thing. There isn't equal evidence for every worldview. There just isn't. As a matter of fact, you have some worldviews that when you find that there are contradictions in those worldviews, it gives you good reasons for thinking that worldview is false, right? If it's contradicting itself, then you have good reasons for not believing that believing that worldview. So here's what I've done. Of course, part of this I had to do as a professor, right? But, as I study worldviews and world religions and even teach worldviews and world religions, what are the claims that are being made, right? So if you think about Islam and Christianity, you could look at the 4th surah in the Quran where it says that Jesus didn't die on the cross. Instead, they hold to what's called the swoon theory, right? He passed out. They would even argue that someone took his place on the cross. Now, what's debated is who took Jesus' place on the cross, but it wasn't him. Because he's a prophet and God wouldn't subject a prophet to that kind of dishonorable death. So somebody else was on that cross. The kind of the prominent theory is that it was Judas, but maybe Simon of Cyrene. That's another one that you might hear thrown out there. If you remember, Simon of Cyrene helps carry the cross, right? But Judas may have been the guy. Now, here's the thing. We can't both be right? What you have in Christianity is it was definitely Jesus that dies on the cross, but you have in Islam that it wasn't him. One or the other is true. The question then becomes, okay, so which worldview, which religion in this case, has the best historical attestation to the claims that are being made around the life and the work of Jesus Christ? And that's when you go back to certain, you're looking for certain criteria that you're using to judge historical documents there. And there's kind of a common thread there that scholars will use. And I don't mean Christian scholars, I just mean scholars. For example, you want early sources. The earlier the sources, the better. The more sources and independent sources you have, the better. And that's when you start looking at it and saying, okay, so, Islam, we're talking about 6 centuries after the fact. There's not even the possibility of any eyewitnesses and so forth. And then you look at what you have in terms of the gospel accounts and the records of Jesus, and you go, we're looking really good here, right? Jesus dies somewhere in the 30s. I know it's give or take 33, 36-ish, something like that. You have some of the earliest letters of Paul being written around 50-ish, give or take. Folks, you got to understand, most of the people are still alive. Everything that was happening in the time of Jesus, those people are still walking around. And so it was the easiest thing in the world to disprove Christianity at that time. This is why Mike Licona says, hey, don't ever forget what's called the Jerusalem factor, right? Where did the events unfold? Jerusalem. Where did a lot of the creeds from the early church begin speaking about the death and resurrection of Jesus start? And the answer was Jerusalem. Where was Jesus' body going to be after his death and his entombment? And the answer was Jerusalem, right? Where was the body? They knew because the guards were appointed to it. And so it's not like it'd be that difficult. Roll the rock, provide the body. Christianity is over. All of the earliest sources that we have and the best are what it is that we open up on a Sunday morning and that we rely on. That's why I like what Craig Evans said, the New Testament scholar. He said, what are the sources that people go to when we're doing archaeology? And the answer is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? It's what we do. It's what we use. We don't go to any infancy gospels. We don't go to any non-canonical literature. We don't go to any of that stuff. We always go back to the Gospels because they're the earliest sources that we have. They're the most reliable sources that we have. And they make very specific claims that rule out other things that deny it. Does that make sense? Yeah. So that's usually where I start. What's the criteria? How are we judging these things? And kind of off I go.
We have a lot of really good questions rolling in, so let's just dive into another one here. Why doesn't God make it easier to find the truth?
Why doesn't God make it easier to find the truth? That's a really good question. We're actually going to deal with this in another evening in terms of a fuller discussion, but sometimes there's this thing called the problem of divine hiddenness. And it's that, why doesn't God just manifest himself in a way that's like completely undeniable, right? Have you ever wondered that? Why doesn't God just descend and be like, whoa, and you're sitting there going, there he is. I'll admit I've wondered the same thing. Here's the catch, though. It's become very unclear to me as to what an undeniable experience of God would even be. It's become very unclear to me. Let me give you an example. Even if a person saw or thought that they saw something descend from the clouds as a Zeus-like figure, right, and say, I most certainly exist as that figure is descending, somebody might actually relegate that just to brain states. right? There's just something going on pretty weird here upstairs, right? And write it off. Or you say, why aren't the arguments for the existence of God rationally inescapable? And part of the reason is because we're more than just a rational creature. There's a lot more that's going on in it. So you realize, this is why we started with the discussion on doubt over the first 3 weeks. There are some things that we just don't want to be true, which is why we kind of shut the ears down, shut the eyes down, and we don't pay attention to things that would give us good reasons for even thinking that it's true. So I'm not trying to avoid the question. I'm just trying to show the difficulty in the question. What is it that's really going on? If a person got torched by a Christian, I'm just being blunt here. If a person gets torched by a Christian, it's like I said before, Christianity isn't true because Christians behave Christianly. It's true because Jesus rose from the dead. But if a person gets torched by a Christian and they walk away from the faith, that's an emotional thing. There's got to be healing there. But that's not necessarily a rational thing. So there's so much to the onion that you kind of have to peel. And honestly, that's just where you go case by case. You just sit down with the person to find out how it is that they got to the place that they are. So again, I'm not trying to avoid the question because I think it's a fair one. I think it's just very difficult to answer because one person's struggle with Christianity might not be the next person's struggle with Christianity. I've asked this question, let me throw this out there, because usually this question comes up in relation to the problem of evil and the problem of suffering. That's usually where it comes up. And so, and I'll leave a name out of this out of respect, but there was a very well-respected philosopher that has written some of the work that has set the trajectory for a lot of the conversation that's happening in discussions on the problem of evil. I was speaking at a conference in Chicago some years ago, and I had an opportunity because, well, he spoke right after me. So there he was, right? And I was doing a little bit of research, and by a little I mean a lot of research on the problem of evil. And I remember sitting down with him, and I said, I have a question for you if you have a little bit of time. And he was like, absolutely, I do. I said, okay, so which came first? Did you have a lot of intellectual concerns with the claims of Christianity and that Christianity intellectually just couldn't answer anything about the problem of evil? Or did you experience something that really just shattered your life? Which came first? And his answer was he had a life-shattering experience first. Now, I bring that up not to dismiss the intellectual concerns that he had, but basically to say maybe what it is that you're dealing with primarily, though, isn't that. Maybe what you're dealing with was something else, because he had come out of a Christian background and walked away from it because of and he didn't tell me what it was, and that's okay, I respect that. But even though he didn't tell me what it was, there was this experience, and he just said, that's it. I'm out. If God really loved me, he wouldn't have let that happen. So I don't know. I don't know what a rationally inescapable argument for the existence of God even looks like. Right? I don't know. And I don't know what a supposed experience that somebody could have that they couldn't try to explain it away in some sort of brain state or something that they ate. Right? It must have been the kimchi at lunch, because I'm just thrown here. You can hear any of these things. So I don't know.
Well, I think our culture puts so much emphasis on individual perspectives and individual perceptions of experience and that I think that it's hard to wade through all of that and even address each of those on that level. So this question is somewhat related to that, and if there's any gray areas, and this one has a lot of votes. So, can I have a low-level baseline morality I expect, like don't lie, cheat, steal, and all other morality above that base is then relative to me, abortion, premarital sex, etc. Mm-hmm. Is there any gray zone?
Is there any gray zone? Yeah, I think that there's definitely some issues that make people kind of pause and go, let me give you an example. And it's a pretty frequent one used. But going back to, I told you I wouldn't do World War II all the time, and I'm about to do it, all right? All right, so here's a kind of a brain teaser that people often use. So, you are housing Polish Jews in your home, and then you have the Germans in some variation, knock on your door and ask if this family that they've been looking for is in your home. Now, here's the thing. You're sitting there going in your head, yeah, they are. But here's the thing. No matter where I'm at, I say, now, how many of you would tell the truth to the Germans? It doesn't matter if I'm at church. It does not matter if I'm at a university. Guess what? Nobody's telling the truth to the Germans. Nobody. Now, that would be an example of something where you go, all right, so here's the catch. I've got two things that I value, and in that moment, it looks like I can't do both, right? One of the things that you value is the truth, and rightly so. In the next thing, you're also valuing life. I mean, you know why they're at the door. This is the famous murder at the door problem, right? You know why they're there. So you value the truth, but you also value life. And this is why there's an ethicist named W.D. Ross, and W.D. Ross said, usually a lot of what it is that we have in ethics, we have values that are scaled, right? Some are, so to speak, more important than others. Or another way of looking at it would be to say, some of those assume the other value. So the most important value that we could possibly have is the value of life itself. And so in this case, some would argue, I'm just showing you a gray area. You asked, right? So I'm showing you a gray area. Some would say, in this case, you have no moral obligation to tell the truth to the Germans because you value life. Next week, since we're doing the abortion discussion and some of the things kind of trending right now, think about this. In the cases of ectopic pregnancy, you have problems where, if you don't do something, then you're going to lose 2 lives. You have to advocate for somebody, right? So here's the conundrum for you, though, right? Because you go, all right, so what does it mean for me to be a good husband if it doesn't mean to advocate for the life of my wife as I'm trying to make a decision? On the flip side, what does it mean to be a good dad and mom if it doesn't mean to advocate for the life of your kid? That's tough. That's tough. And we don't need to pretend like it isn't. That's tough. But here's the thing. You better be advocating for life in some capacity in that situation, right? We'll save that one for next week. Don't do that, all right? I was just throwing that out there. So are there gray areas? I'm going to be fair. The answer is yeah, there are gray areas. How about some of the supposed miracle accounts that have happened in the history of Christianity? I'm telling you, I've looked at some of those and I'm like, yeah, I'm not sold. I am just not sold. And then I look at others and I go, yep, that one I can go with. Now I'm thinking through a number of things as I go there, but there are even gray areas with modern day miracle reports, ancient miracle reports. There are gray areas in a number of places. So the thing that I was trying to get at here is, it's not, is a person affirming relativism as true, but we were asking a deeper question. That if you say relativism is true, one, it's incoherent. Remember that, right? It's incoherent. But if you're saying it's true, you're making a statement about the nature of truth. This is the way it just is. And that's why I said you can't cherry pick. Well, it's objective here, it's subjective here. Because the nature of it is one way or the other. So that gets back to the first part of the question.
Yeah.
Hopefully helpful.
Anybody else really mind blown? Totally confused? Good.
No, you're thinking so clearly right now, right?
Lots of gray area.
There are some gray areas. All right, how many of you would agree with me tonight? There are some gray areas. Now, listen, here's the thing. When you've got a black or a white, take it. Take it. Take it. Because there are going to be plenty of other times that you sit there and you go, all right, now I'm going to have to think about that. Take the black and the white when it happens.
I think that's a good point there.
But there are gray areas.
We do have a tendency to love to oversimplify things. And there's rarely times in life that it's just really simple. So, all right,
usually
another
layers.
question. We're running out of time.
Okay,
so the challenge with relativism is that it often masquerades as some other form of belief, thus making it difficult to really identify and pinpoint. Is there a foolproof test to do so?
All right, so I'm trying to get the question.
I'll read it again.
Okay.
The challenge with relativism is that it often masquerades as some other form of belief, which makes it difficult to really identify and pinpoint. So somebody is giving their belief structure, and it's got some relativism in it. So how do you test whether or not they really are holding a relativism perspective?
Yeah, okay. So if I'm understanding the question right, here's the thing. So you go back into the 1930s, and there was a lady named Ruth Benedict. She was an anthropologist. She went and studied a lot of practices around the world. And she gave one of the earliest defenses of relativism. This is, again, back in the 1930s. World War II is going to show up again here soon because most people are like, surely we want to say Hitler was bad, right? And if you're right, then we can't really do that. Nevertheless, here was the thing, and I think maybe this might get down to it. Sometimes what it is we confuse what is really going on. So what she observed is she would go out into some Pacific Rim cultures, and did you know the women dressed differently out there? In fact, there were parts of their body that they left exposed that if a woman were to do that in the United States, she might get arrested. Right? And so she points that out. Basically then to make draw the conclusion that, morality is actually relative to a culture. Now that's one example I'm bringing up, and that's, for the sake of time, that's all I'm bringing up in her book, all right? Now here's the thing, and this is where I think she just kind of got it wrong. Not kind of, she just got it wrong, all right? What you have are certain what are called mores. Have you heard the word mores? You have conventions and social practices, right? But if she actually had looked a little bit deeper, what she would find is that the parts of a woman's body that a man found sexually stimulating or attractive, even in those Pacific Rim cultures, the women were covering up. And so she missed it. What she was noticing was there was a specific more or a cultural practice different from ours. Nobody's even questioning that because it was. Then drew the wrong conclusion. Specifically in this case about sexual ethics, right? They had a freer and more liberated view of human sexuality. When in fact, you had other anthropologists that came years later, studied the same people, and found that they were actually much more strict than what it was that we believed and even practiced here in the United States. You get the idea? She missed it. So she identified the more or the cultural practice and drew a moral principle. When in fact what the moral principle was, there's a right way and a wrong way to look at human sexuality. And it wasn't based on culture. Instead, the practice to protect that value, which was much like ours, just differed from culture to culture. So in that case, here's what I would say. I don't think that culture was endorsing relativism in any stripe. They just had a different practice to protect the same things that frankly I would, and that I would think is worthy of protection. In this case, it was just sexual ethics. So there you go. I don't know if that helped, but there's something to think about.
I think we're all sitting here like, lots to think about.
Yeah.
All right, one more question,
Okay.
and we'll tackle some of these other ones through social media this week. But
Melody's going to be answering the questions this week, by the way.
Oh.
All right, just throwing that.
Be sure to tune in.
And if you don't like any of my answers, remember, my name is Mark Barnhill. You can email me at mbarnhill@woodridge.org.
Poor Mark. He's going to be getting a lot of emails this week. Okay, so last
let's do one more.
Since truth claims require the application of logic, how do we speak intelligently to those who don't process information logically? We all know those people.
That's kind of a fair question, though, isn't it? Right? How do? Yeah.
Some of us know a lot of those people.
Yeah. Well, remember 1 Peter 3:15 and 16, right? Always have a defense for the hope that is within you, but present yourself with gentleness and respect. And so always present yourself with gentleness and respect. So here would be a bad example. So somebody says something, you're like, that might be the dumbest thing I've heard in my life. Usually when you say that, the conversation is pretty much over right then, right? You just kind of shut things down. Honestly, here's the approach that I usually take when I'm talking with people. I like Socrates. And a lot of what Socrates would do is ask questions. And I think that it's good to ask a lot of questions because, one, I just want to understand where a person is coming from. And that means that I tend to listen a lot more a lot of times than I even talk. Because I just want to know where the person is coming from, right? So, in asking questions, it teases out the commitments that the person is making, only to help them see that maybe it's not adding up, right? Just by even asking questions, right? So I'll give you one example, and this actually goes back to New Orleans, when I lived in New Orleans. So there was a Buddhist that I got to know, and really a cool guy. But here was the idea. The world, this is where the matrix comes in, all right? So the world that you see is an illusion, right? And the problem that we have here is that we buy into the illusion of the appearances of the world that is around us. Now, I'm having this conversation with the guy in New Orleans. So as we have the conversation, he says, now here's the problem. What that means is since all of this is an illusion, then the nature of reality itself is that everything is just one. Now, you heard me talk about that before, right? Because I mentioned that earlier tonight. Everything is just one. And the whole source of the human predicament is that we believe in differences, that you and I really are different, subject and object, right? And I said, okay. Now I'm sitting there admittedly going, where do you start? Where do you start? I said, okay, let me ask you a question, because I'm really trying to understand. And I really was trying to understand. I said, let me ask you a question. Who are you talking to right now? And he said, you. And I said, okay, but I said, I'm really trying to understand, because I was. If you're telling me that you're talking to me, then doesn't that by definition mean that you and I are different? You see it? You know, subject and object. Everything is really just one. And we buy into this idea that we really... And I said, well, then who are you talking to? And he said, you. And I'm like, I agree with you. But wouldn't that mean that you and I are different? And we're not really just one? He goes, no, see, you've done it again. I don't, no, you just did it again. I'm trying to make a point here. And it took us about 30 minutes. And I've got 3 of my seminary students sitting with me. They just let me totally take the reins on this. They were totally useless to me that day, right? I said, no, you're the one that keeps saying this. You keep talking to me. How about this? What is it that is the fundamental human problem? I said, because I really think the fundamental problem is sin and our need for redemption. But what do you think is the fundamental human problem? And he said, it's that we're not enlightened. I said, okay. I said, can I ask you a question? And he said, yes. I said, have you attained enlightenment? He said, yes, I have. I said, have I? And he said, no, you have not. All right. No, you have not. And I was like, okay. So once again, you've made a distinction here. The enlightened and the unenlightened. So here goes my point. Even though that he said everything is an illusion, right? At every step, even though he was enlightened, at every step in our conversation, guess what he was doing? He was treating me as different from him. He was treating himself as enlightened. I was unenlightened. And we also completely disagreed on what the nature of the real problem facing humanity even is. So that's one way I think of, I'm trying to help you see kind of the process that I take. I'm going to ask those kinds of questions. And eventually, I know you're wondering where this goes with the guy, right? After a while, he just sits there. He sits there for about a minute, like dead still, and he goes, man, I don't know. I don't think I'm making any sense anymore. And I said, okay, do you want to know what I think now? And he goes, actually, I do. And I said, okay. And so off we went. But what I was waiting for was for him to be open to that conversation. I was not interested in kicking that door down. And if I didn't have that moment, now let me be fair, he didn't walk away believing in the Lord by the time that we were done, right? But we were further down the road than before we had started. So I don't know if that helps you. That's a little bit of the approach. That's a little bit of the approach that I take. I'm going to try to ask some insightful questions about what they believe and why. And when I see that there's, that's not exactly adding up, I didn't say, hey, you know what? You're just wrong. You don't make any sense. Hey, you know, you're contradicting yourself. And by the way, I could have said that because he was. Instead, I just said, I'm trying to make sense out of something here. I just want to understand. And at the end of the day, I think he realized he wasn't making sense out of stuff. He realized it for himself. And I was like, hey, if that's all we got out of today, today was a good day of work. We'll have a conversation tomorrow. So there you go.
I think the short answer to that question, if I can summarize everything that you just said, is patience. Lots and lots of patience.
I said a lot more than be patient. I thought I did. Anyway, so there you go.
That was very helpful.
Can I throw out a resource for you?
No.
Well, I'm about to anyway. So Greg Kokel has a book that maybe is worth picking up. It's called Tactics. And all it is in the book Tactics is he gives you some different ways of navigating different conversations with people. Because here's the thing, I haven't found one person, I think this is a good way to end it tonight, all right? I haven't found one person that thinks that these questions are unimportant. I haven't found one. Everybody knows that they're important because if God exists, it makes all the difference in the world and you want to know him, right? It's important. The question is how do we do this well? So I'm just going to commend that resource to you. Greg Kokel, it's K-O-U-K-L, and his book is called Tactics. I think that's a great way to end the night.
Sounds good.
And then we'll answer some more questions this week, and we'll pop it out on social media for you. Some of the questions, by the way, we've bumped to have a whole night about.
Right.
So kind of hold on to it.
Yeah, if you notice that some of these questions don't get answered, it's because some of them are big enough questions that we're dedicating a whole night to them. We try to remain on topic as much as possible, but we are saving those questions to be able to tackle them in future weeks. Jeremy will be down front if you want to come and throw some more questions at him. But some of these other questions we will post on social media later this week. Next week, you'll want to be here for our hot topic discussion of abortion. We're going to try to throw in some of these really current issues, and so if something comes up, like we've been hearing a lot about the abortion debate here just in the last few weeks, so I think we'll make a few people mad.
It's going to be interesting.
Yeah, we like to ruffle some feathers, get a little attention. Woohoo! So next week we'll be tackling that, and then we'll head back to our discussion of truth and knowledge and how we know what the truth is. And if you are enjoying tonight and if tonight was helpful and you want to help support what is going on here at Veritas, we welcome any and all support. You can drop any monetary support in the offering box at the door on your way out. So thank you all so much for coming, and we will see you next week.
Have a great week. We'll see you.